The woods remember everything, every footstep that breaks a twig, every breath that fogs the cold air, every moment someone walks in and never walks out. And in the fall of 2019, the forests surrounding Mount Rainier in Washington state remembered Tyler Bennett. He was 17, a kid who preferred trees to people, silence to noise. His mother, Linda Bennett, would later tell investigators that Tyler had always been drawn to the wilderness, ever since his father died when Tyler was 12. The forest became his refuge, his church, the place where he felt closest to something he couldn't name. Every weekend, he'd pack his father's old jacket, a thermos of coffee, that leather journal, and he'd disappear into the Cascade foothills for hours, sometimes a whole day. He always came back before dark, except that Saturday in late October. That Saturday, he didn't come back at all. The morning he left, Linda was still asleep. Tyler had scribbled a note on the kitchen counter, Clearwater Creek Trail, back by 5. Love you. He'd drawn a small smiley face next to his name, the way he always did. It was 6:15 in the morning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. Fog blanketed the valley roads as he drove his old Honda Civic toward the trailhead, windows cracked, cold air pouring in. A gas station clerk in Enumclaw would later remember seeing him buy a granola bar and a bottle of water. Said Tyler seemed normal. Quiet, polite, nothing unusual. By 6:45, Tyler's car was parked at the Clearwater Creek trailhead. Empty. Locked. His phone was inside, sitting on the passenger seat. He'd left it there on purpose. He always did. Said it ruined the experience. Said the forest deserved his full attention. When 5 o'clock came and went that evening, Linda wasn't worried. Not yet. Tyler had stayed out late before, lost track of time sketching or following a deer trail. But by 7, when the sky went black and the temperature dropped into the 30s, she called his phone. It rang and rang in the empty car. By 8, she was in her own car, driving toward the trailhead with a flashlight and a rising knot of panic in her chest. She found his Civic right where he'd left it, doors locked, phone glowing on the seat, no sign of her son. Linda called the Pierce County Sheriff's Office at 8:32 that night. A missing person report was filed within the hour. By dawn, the next morning, search and rescue teams were combing the Clearwater Creek area. Deputies, volunteers, K-9 units, even a helicopter scanning the canopy from above. The trail Tyler had taken was well marked for the first 2 miles, winding along the creek through dense Douglas fir and western hemlock. But after that, the path fractured into dozens of unmarked routes used by hunters and experienced hikers. It was easy to get lost. Easy to take a wrong turn and end up miles from where you started. The first day of searching turned up nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if Tyler had simply evaporated into the fog. On the second day, a volunteer found something near the trail's edge, about 1.5 miles in. A page torn from a journal pinned beneath a moss-covered rock. The paper was damp, but still legible. On it was a pencil sketch, a handprint pressed into mud. The print was enormous, easily twice the size of a human hand, with long fingers and a wide palm. Beneath the sketch, in Tyler's handwriting, something watching, not alone. The discovery sent a chill through the search teams. Linda Bennett, when shown the page, broke down. She recognized her son's handwriting immediately, recognized the journal he carried everywhere. But the sketch, the handprint, she didn't know what to make of it. Neither did the investigators. Detective Sarah Ortiz, a veteran with the Pierce County Sheriff's Office, took lead on the case. She was methodical, skeptical, the kind of investigator who trusted evidence over intuition. When she saw the sketch, her first thought was that Tyler had stumbled onto a bear print and misidentified it. Black bears were common in the area, and their tracks, under certain conditions, could look vaguely hand-like. But the size bothered her. Even a large bear's print wouldn't match the proportions Tyler had drawn. And the note, something watching, that suggested Tyler had felt threatened, or at least uneasy. Ortiz ordered the search expanded. Teams pushed deeper into the forest, following game trails and old logging roads. They checked abandoned cabins, hunting blinds, even a few remote campsites used by backpackers. Nothing. Tyler Bennett had vanished without a trace. By the fourth day, the media had picked up the story. Local news stations ran segments on the missing teen, showing his school photo, a shy smile, eyes that seemed older than 17. Linda Bennett appeared on camera, pleading for information, her voice cracking as she described her son. The story spread online, shared thousands of times, tips poured in, most led nowhere. But one tip stood out. A man named Eugene Marsh called the sheriff's office on the fifth day of the search. Marsh was a retired logger, 73 years old, who lived alone in a cabin about 8 miles northwest of the Clearwater Creek trailhead. He told the dispatcher he'd heard something strange the night Tyler disappeared, something he couldn't explain. Detective Ortiz drove out to interview him the next morning. Marsh's cabin sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The old man met Ortiz on his porch, a rifle leaning against the doorframe behind him. He was wary at first, the way people who live alone in the woods often are, but he softened when Ortiz explained why she was there. "I heard it around midnight," Marsh said, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes. "Woke me up out of a dead sleep. It was a sound I've never heard before, and I've been in these woods 50 years. Ortiz asked him to describe it. Marsh hesitated, his weathered face creasing with uncertainty. "It was like a scream," he said finally, "but not human, not animal either, something in between. High-pitched at first, then it dropped low like a growl, lasted maybe 10 seconds, then nothing. Dead silence, not even the wind." Ortiz wrote it down, keeping her expression neutral. "Could it have been a cougar?" she asked. "They can make some pretty unsettling sounds." Marsh shook his head. "I know cougars. This wasn't that. This was bigger, deeper, and it came from the direction of Clearwater Creek." Ortiz thanked him and left, but the conversation stayed with her. She didn't believe in monsters or myths, but she believed in fear. And Eugene Marsh, a man who'd spent half a century in the wilderness, had been genuinely afraid. The search continued for 2 more weeks. Volunteers dwindled as the weather turned colder, and the chances of finding Tyler alive grew slimmer. By mid-November, the official search was scaled back to periodic checks by park rangers and sheriff's deputies. The case remained open, but resources were limited. Tyler Bennett joined the growing list of people who disappeared into the Pacific Northwest wilderness and never come out. Linda Bennett refused to give up. She printed flyers, organized her own search parties, walked the trails herself until her feet bled. She left voicemails on Detective Ortiz's phone, begging for updates, demanding answers. Ortiz had none to give. The case had gone cold. Winter came. Snow blanketed the Cascades, burying trails and erasing whatever evidence might have remained. The forest went silent, locked in ice and darkness, and Tyler Bennett's name faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. But the woods remembered. 4 months later, in late February 2020, a pair of cross-country skiers stumbled onto something impossible. They were exploring an area about 12 miles northeast of the Clearwater Creek trailhead, far off any marked trail. The snow was deep, the terrain brutal, but the skiers, both experienced backcountry enthusiasts, were looking for untouched powder. What they found instead was a cabin. It wasn't on any map. No roads led to it. The structure was old, maybe 60 or 70 years, built from rough-hewn logs and barely standing. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the windows were dark, covered from the inside with what looked like old blankets. Smoke rose from a crooked metal chimney. Someone was inside. The skiers approached cautiously, calling out. No response. They knocked on the door. Still nothing. One of them tried the handle. It wasn't locked. The door swung open, and the smell hit them first. Wood smoke, sweat, something feral and unwashed. The interior was dim, lit only by a dying fire in a stone hearth, and there, huddled in the corner beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, was Tyler Bennett. He was alive, barely recognizable, but alive. His hair had grown long and matted. His face was gaunt, covered in a patchy beard. His father's green jacket hung off his frame like a scarecrow's coat. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes, were alert, wide, and filled with something the skiers would later describe as terror. Tyler didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at them, breathing hard, his hands clutching the blankets like a lifeline. The skiers called 911. Within 2 hours, a rescue team reached the cabin. Paramedics wrapped Tyler in thermal blankets, checked his vitals, started an IV. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, suffering from frostbite on his fingers and toes. But he was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. Detective Ortiz arrived at the hospital in Tacoma that evening. Tyler had been admitted to the ICU, stable but unresponsive. He hadn't spoken a word since being found. Linda Bennett sat at his bedside, weeping, holding his hand, whispering his name over and over. Ortiz stood in the doorway, watching, trying to make sense of it. How had Tyler survived 4 months in the wilderness in winter? Where had he found food, water, and that cabin? Who did it belong to? How had he known it was there? The questions multiplied when the forensics team processed the cabin 2 days later. The structure was ancient, abandoned decades ago, likely built by a trapper or hermit long dead. Inside, investigators found evidence of recent habitation. A pile of pine boughs, arranged as a makeshift bed, empty cans of food stacked in the corner, a rusted pot near the hearth. But they also found something else. On the floor near the door, scattered across the rough wooden planks, were clumps of hair. Not human hair, not bear or deer, or any animal the forensics team could immediately identify. The strands were coarse, dark brown, almost black, and unnaturally long, some measuring over a foot. The texture was unlike anything in their database. It wasn't fur, it wasn't human, it was something in between. The samples were sent to a lab in Seattle for analysis. Results would take weeks. In the meantime, Detective Ortiz tried to interview Tyler. He'd been moved out of the ICU into a private room, his physical condition improving, but mentally, he was somewhere else. He stared at the walls, flinched at sudden sounds, refused to eat unless his mother fed him by hand. When Ortiz asked him what happened in the woods, Tyler's eyes filled with tears. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shook his head, looked away. Linda Bennett begged Ortiz to give him time. "He's traumatized," she said. "He needs space. He'll talk when he's ready." But Ortiz wasn't sure he ever would be. The lab results came back 3 weeks later. The hair samples were inconclusive. The DNA was degraded, contaminated, impossible to match to any known species. The report suggested the samples might be from a primate, but the markers were inconsistent with any primate native to North America. One lab technician, off the record, told Ortiz the results were anomalous and recommended further testing. But the department's budget was stretched thin, and the case was already closed. Tyler had been found alive. There was no crime to investigate. Still, Ortiz couldn't let it go. She returned to the cabin alone one afternoon in early March, hiking through melting snow to reach the remote structure. She stood in the doorway, looking at the cold hearth, the scattered cans, the clumps of hair still visible in the corners. She tried to imagine Tyler here, alone, terrified, surviving, and she tried to imagine what else might have been here with him. The forest was silent around her, no birds, no wind. Just the slow drip of snowmelt from the trees. Ortiz left the cabin and never went back. Tyler Bennett was discharged from the hospital in mid-March. He returned home with his mother to the same house, the same room, the same life he'd left behind. But he wasn't the same. He barely spoke. He didn't go back to school. He spent most of his days sitting by the window, staring out at the trees in the backyard, his father's green jacket draped over his shoulders. Linda tried everything. Therapy, medication, support groups. Nothing worked. Tyler remained locked inside himself, trapped in whatever he'd experienced in those woods. And then one night in April, he finally spoke. Linda was sitting with him in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background. Tyler turned to her, his voice hoarse from disuse, and said, "It wasn't alone." Linda froze. "What wasn't alone, honey?" Tyler's eyes were distant, unfocused. "In the cabin. I wasn't alone." Who was with you?" Linda asked, her heart pounding. Tyler didn't answer. He just turned back to the window, back to the trees, and said nothing more. Was that just coincidence? Or something we can't explain? The weeks following Tyler's cryptic statement were agonizing for Linda Bennett. She tried to coax more information from her son, sitting with him for hours, asking gentle questions, never pushing too hard. But Tyler had retreated back into silence. Whatever door had briefly opened that April night had closed again, locked from the inside. His therapist, Dr. Rachel Kimura, a trauma specialist who'd worked with survivors of extreme isolation, told Linda that Tyler's mind was protecting itself, that the memories of those 4 months were too overwhelming to process all at once. "He'll share when he's ready," Dr. Kimura said during one of their sessions. Forcing it could do more harm than good. But Linda wasn't sure they had time to wait. Tyler was deteriorating. He'd lost more weight. He barely slept. When he did, he woke screaming, thrashing against blankets, his eyes wild with panic. He refused to go outside, even to the backyard. The sight of trees through the window seemed to paralyze him with fear. Detective Ortiz, meanwhile, couldn't shake the case. Officially, it was closed. Tyler had been found. There was no evidence of foul play, and the department had moved on to active investigations. But the unanswered questions gnawed at her. How had Tyler survived? What had he eaten? Where had the food cans in the cabin come from? And that hair, those impossible samples that matched nothing in any database. She started digging into the history of the area, spending her off hours at the Pierce County Library, scrolling through old newspaper archives and land records. The cabin where Tyler was found sat on what used to be private timberland, sold and resold multiple times over the past century. The last recorded owner was a man named Walter Grimes, a trapper who'd lived there in the 1950s. Grimes had died in 1962, and the property had been absorbed into the National Forest. No one had lived there since, at least not officially. But Ortiz found something else in those archives. A pattern. Over the past 70 years, there had been at least a dozen reports of strange occurrences in that specific area of the Cascades. Hikers reporting massive footprints in the mud. Hunters describing a foul smell that drove game animals away. A forest ranger in 1978 filing a report about finding a deer carcass hung 12 feet up in a tree, its neck broken, the body partially consumed. The ranger had written, "No predator I know of could have done this." And then there were the disappearances. Not many, just 3 others that Ortiz could find. A logger in 1967 who vanished during his shift and was never found. A teenage girl in 1989 who went missing on a camping trip. Her body was discovered 6 weeks later, miles from where she'd disappeared, cause of death listed as exposure, though the coroner's notes mentioned unusual trauma that was never explained. And a bow hunter in 2003 who called his wife from the woods saying he was being followed, then never made it back to his truck. None of these cases had been connected. They were spread across decades, handled by different agencies, filed away and forgotten. But they all happened within a 15-mile radius of that cabin. Ortiz compiled everything into a file she kept at home, separate from official records. She knew how it would look if she brought it to her captain, like she was chasing shadows, wasting time on folklore. But the evidence was there, scattered and circumstantial, yet undeniable. Something had been in those woods for a very long time. She decided to reach out to someone who might understand. Dr. Marcus Webb was a cultural anthropologist at the University of Washington, specializing in indigenous folklore and cryptozoology, the study of animals whose existence hadn't been scientifically proven. Ortiz had heard him speak at a conference years ago, back when she'd been a rookie deputy. He was serious, academic, not the sensationalist type. If anyone could look at her file objectively, it was him. They met at a coffee shop in Seattle on a rainy afternoon in May. Ortiz laid out everything: the timeline of Tyler's disappearance, the cabin, the hair samples, the historical reports. Webb listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook. When she finished, he sat back and sighed. "You know what you're describing, don't you?" Ortiz nodded slowly. "I know what it sounds like. But I'm not ready to call it that." Webb smiled faintly. "Smart. The moment you name it, people stop taking you seriously." He tapped his pen against the notebook. "But the pattern you found, it's consistent with reports from all over the Pacific Northwest. Sightings, encounters, evidence that doesn't fit conventional explanations. The Lummi and Snoqualmie tribes have stories going back centuries about a forest guardian, a creature they call Tisemeques. The Salish call it Saskets. White settlers anglicized it to Sasquatch. I'm not investigating Bigfoot," Ortiz said firmly. "I'm investigating what happened to Tyler Bennett. And I'm telling you," Webb replied, "that those two things might not be separate." He leaned forward. "Look, I'm not saying there's a giant ape-man living in the woods. I'm saying there's something in that ecosystem we don't understand. Maybe it's a relic population of Gigantopithecus that survived the Ice Age. Maybe it's an undiscovered species of great ape. Or maybe it's something else entirely, something that's learned to avoid human contact so effectively that we've only ever caught glimpses." Ortiz felt a chill run down her spine. "You think Tyler encountered one?" "I think Tyler survived 4 months in the wilderness during winter, which should have been impossible," Webb said. "And I think the only way that makes sense is if he had help." The idea was absurd. And yet, it was the only explanation that fit. Ortiz asked Webb if he'd be willing to examine the cabin site himself. He agreed immediately. 2 weeks later, they hiked out to the location together, accompanied by a wildlife biologist named Dr. Stephanie Chen, whom Webb had brought along for a second opinion. The cabin looked worse than Ortiz remembered. The spring thaw had caused part of the roof to collapse, and the interior was damp and moldy. But the evidence was still there: the makeshift bed, the cans, the scattered hair. Dr. Chen collected fresh samples, photographing everything meticulously. Outside, Webb found something Ortiz had missed during her first visit. About 30 yards from the cabin, near a cluster of old-growth cedars, there were marks on the trees. Deep gouges in the bark, running vertically, starting about 7 feet off the ground and extending up to nearly 10 feet. The cuts were old, weathered, but still visible. "Claw marks," Dr. Chen said, examining them closely, "but not from any bear I've ever seen. The spacing is wrong, and the depth, whatever made these, was incredibly strong." Webb pulled out a tape measure, documenting the height and width of the marks. "If this was territorial marking," he said, "then whatever made it was tall, very tall." They spent the rest of the day searching the area, finding more signs: broken branches high in the canopy, a depression in the ground that might have been a sleeping nest, and a scattering of bones near a creek. Dr. Chen identified them as deer remains, but the way they'd been broken suggested something with immense bite force. As the sun began to set, they hiked back to their vehicles. No one spoke much. The forest felt different now, watchful, aware. Ortiz found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Back in Seattle, Dr. Chen analyzed the new hair samples. The results were the same as before. Inconclusive, anomalous, impossible to classify. But she did find something interesting. The hair contained trace amounts of human DNA, not enough to identify an individual, but enough to confirm that whoever or whatever had left the hair had been in close contact with a human being. With Tyler. Ortiz knew she needed to talk to him again, but Linda Bennett was protective, and Tyler's condition hadn't improved. Dr. Kimura advised against any interview that might re-traumatize him. Ortiz was stuck. Then, in early June, something changed. Tyler started drawing again. Linda found him one morning at the kitchen table, his old journal open in front of him, a pencil moving across the page. She almost cried with relief. It was the first time he'd shown interest in anything since coming home. She didn't interrupt, just watched from the doorway as her son sketched. When he finally set the pencil down and left the room, Linda approached the table. What she saw made her blood run cold. The drawing showed the interior of the cabin, the stone hearth, the pile of blankets, the rough wooden walls, but in the corner, partially hidden in shadow, was a figure. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. The face was obscured, but the eyes were visible, 2 pale circles staring out from the darkness, and in the foreground, small and fragile, was Tyler himself, curled up by the fire. Linda called Detective Ortiz immediately. Ortiz arrived within the hour, bringing Dr. Webb with her. They sat with Tyler in the living room, the journal open between them. Tyler stared at the drawing, his hands trembling. "Tyler," Ortiz said gently, "can you tell us about this? About what you drew?" For a long moment, Tyler said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "It brought me food." Linda gasped. Ortiz leaned forward. "What brought you food?" Tyler's eyes remained fixed on the drawing. "I was lost. It was getting dark. I was so cold. I thought I was going to die." His voice cracked. "And then I saw the cabin. The door was open. There was a fire inside. I thought someone lived there, that they'd help me." "But no one was there?" Ortiz asked. Tyler shook his head. "Not at first. I went inside. I warmed up. I fell asleep. When I woke up, there were cans of food next to me. Beans, soup. I didn't know where they came from. I thought maybe I'd missed them in the dark." "But that wasn't it," Webb said softly. Tyler's hands clenched into fists. "The next night I heard something outside. Footsteps, heavy, slow. I was terrified. I hid under the blankets. The door opened." He paused, his breathing quickening. "I looked. I saw it." "What did you see?" Ortiz asked. Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "It was huge, covered in dark hair. It stood in the doorway just watching me. I thought it was going to kill me. But it didn't. It just set something down on the floor. More food, and then it left." The room was silent, except for the sound of Tyler's ragged breathing. "It came back every few days," he continued. "Always at night, always with food, sometimes wood for the fire. It never came close, never touched me, just watched, like it was making sure I was okay." Linda was crying now, her hand over her mouth. Ortiz felt her own throat tighten. "Why didn't you leave?" Webb asked gently. "Why didn't you try to find your way back?" Tyler finally looked up, his pale blue eyes haunted. "Because I tried. The first week I tried to leave. I got maybe a mile from the cabin before I collapsed. I was too weak. Too cold. I would have died out there." He wiped his eyes. "It found me. It carried me back to the cabin. I don't remember much, but I remember the smell, like wet earth and pine. And I remember feeling safe." Ortiz exchanged a glance with Webb. This was beyond anything she'd imagined. "Tyler," she said carefully, Do you know what it was? He shook his head. I don't know. I don't want to know. I just want to forget. But forgetting, Ortiz knew, wasn't an option. Not anymore. Could something that terrifying also be something that saved his life? Tyler's confession changed everything. What had been a missing person case with a miraculous ending now became something far more complex, a story that defied easy explanation, that sat uncomfortably between the rational and the impossible. Detective Ortiz knew that if she included Tyler's account in any official report, she'd be laughed out of the department. But she also knew, deep in her gut, that he was telling the truth. Dr. Webb felt the same way. After the interview, he and Ortiz sat in his university office, surrounded by books on folklore and evolutionary biology, trying to make sense of what they'd heard. He's not lying, Webb said, pouring them both coffee from a thermos. I've interviewed dozens of people who claim to have seen something unexplained in the woods. Most of them are embellishing, seeking attention, or misidentifying known animals. Tyler's different. He's traumatized. He doesn't want to talk about this. That's the hallmark of a genuine experience. Ortiz wrapped her hands around the warm mug. So what are we saying? That there's a creature out there that's intelligent enough to recognize a human in distress and compassionate enough to keep him alive for 4 months? That's exactly what I'm saying, Webb replied. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. We know great apes are capable of empathy. Gorillas have been observed protecting human children. Orangutans use tools and demonstrate problem-solving abilities. If there's a North American primate we haven't classified yet, something that's evolved in isolation for thousands of years, it's entirely possible it could exhibit similar behaviors. But why? Ortiz pressed. Why would it help Tyler? Webb shrugged. Why do humans help injured animals? Compassion isn't unique to our species. Maybe it saw Tyler as vulnerable, non-threatening. Maybe it was curious. Or maybe, he paused, choosing his words carefully, maybe it's happened before. That thought haunted Ortiz. She returned to her research, digging deeper into historical records, and she found something that made her stomach turn. In 1989, when that teenage girl, Melissa Hartman, had disappeared on a camping trip, her body had been found 6 weeks later in a ravine. The official cause of death was exposure, but the coroner's report contained details that had been omitted from the public record. Melissa's body had been covered with branches and leaves, arranged deliberately, almost ritually. Her backpack was found nearby, empty except for a collection of pine cones and smooth river stones, items she hadn't packed. The coroner noted that her clothing was cleaner than it should have been after 6 weeks in the wilderness, and there were no signs of animal predation, despite the body being exposed. It was as if something had been caring for her, even after she died. Ortiz requested the full case file from archives. It took 3 weeks to arrive, a dusty box filled with photographs, witness statements, and evidence logs. She spread everything across her dining room table and worked through it methodically. One photograph stopped her cold. It showed Melissa's campsite, taken the day after she was reported missing. In the foreground was her tent, still zipped closed. But in the background, barely visible in the tree line, was something else. A shape. Tall, dark, partially obscured by branches. It could have been a shadow, a trick of light, a stain on the film. But it could also have been something standing there, watching. Ortiz scanned the photo and sent it to Dr. Chen, the wildlife biologist. Chen called her back within hours. I enhanced the image, Chen said, her voice tight with excitement. There's definitely something there. The proportions are wrong for a bear or a human. It's too tall, too broad in the shoulders. And look at this, Ortiz heard typing on the other end. I'm sending you the enhanced version now. The email arrived seconds later. Ortiz opened the attachment, and her breath caught. The shape was clearer now, though still indistinct. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with a massive torso and long arms hanging past its knees. The head was conical, almost sagittal, covered in dark hair. And though the face was in shadow, there was the suggestion of eyes, 2 pale spots reflecting the camera flash. It was watching Melissa's campsite, just watching. "Jesus," Ortiz whispered. "There's more," Chen said. "I ran the image through a comparative analysis with known wildlife silhouettes. It doesn't match anything, not bears, not elk, not humans in bulky clothing. Whatever that is, it's not something we have in our databases." Ortiz thanked her and hung up, staring at the image for a long time. If this thing had been watching Melissa's campsite in 1989, and if it had helped Tyler in 2019, then it had been in those woods for at least 30 years. Probably longer. She needed more evidence, something concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed as shadows or misidentification. In late June, Ortiz organized a small expedition back to the cabin site. She brought Dr. Webb, Dr. Chen, and a documentary filmmaker named Jason Ruiz, who specialized in wildlife cinematography. Ruiz had worked on projects for National Geographic and the BBC, and he had access to high-end equipment, thermal cameras, motion-activated trail cams, audio recording devices sensitive enough to pick up sounds miles away. "If there's something out there," Ruiz said as they loaded gear into his truck, "we'll find it." They hiked into the area on a Thursday morning, the forest thick with summer growth. The cabin was slowly being reclaimed by nature. Vines crawled up the walls, and saplings pushed through gaps in the floorboards. But the claw marks on the nearby trees were still visible, and Dr. Chen found fresh evidence. A tuft of dark hair snagged on a low branch, and a footprint in the soft earth near the creek. The print was enormous. 17 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Dr. Chen made a plaster cast while Webb photographed it from every angle. "This was made recently," Chen said, examining the edges of the print. "Within the last week, maybe less. The soil hasn't eroded yet." They set up a perimeter of trail cameras around the cabin, positioning them at various heights and angles. Ruiz placed audio recorders in the trees, programmed to activate at the slightest sound. They also set up a thermal camera aimed at the clearing in front of the cabin, capable of detecting heat signatures up to 300 yards away. Then they waited. They camped a quarter-mile from the cabin, far enough not to disturb the site, but close enough to respond if the cameras triggered. The first night was uneventful. The forest was alive with normal sounds. Owls hooting, branches creaking, the distant rush of the creek. Ortiz barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. The second night, everything changed. At 2:17 in the morning, Ruiz's laptop chimed. One of the trail cameras had been triggered. They scrambled out of their tents, pulling on boots and jackets. Ruiz pulled up the live feed on his screen. The thermal camera showed a heat signature moving through the clearing. It was large, bipedal, walking upright with a slow, deliberate gait. The figure paused near the cabin, its head turning as if scanning the area. Then it moved closer, reaching out toward the door. "Holy shit," Webb breathed. The figure pushed the cabin door open and stepped inside. For several minutes, it remained there, invisible to the exterior cameras. Then it emerged, carrying something, a bundle of branches maybe, or a piece of fabric. It set the object down near the door, then turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the trees. The entire encounter lasted less than 5 minutes. They waited until dawn before approaching the cabin, not wanting to risk a confrontation in the dark. When they finally reached the site, they found what the figure had left. A pile of fresh pine boughs, arranged in the same way Tyler had described his makeshift bed, and next to it, a rusted can of beans. "It's still doing it," Ortiz said, her voice shaking. It's still bringing supplies, like it's waiting for someone to come back. Doctor. Chen examined the pine boughs, noting how carefully they'd been arranged. This is deliberate. This is intentional behavior. Whatever this is, it's not acting on instinct. It's thinking. They reviewed the footage from all the cameras. The thermal images were clear. Something large and warm-blooded had visited the cabin. But the standard trail cameras, which should have captured visible light images, showed nothing, just empty frames, as if the figure had somehow avoided every lens. It knows where the cameras are, Ruiz said, scrolling through the files. It's avoiding them on purpose. Webb nodded slowly. That level of awareness suggests high intelligence. It's not just avoiding humans, it's avoiding human technology. They stayed 2 more nights, but the figure didn't return. On the 3rd morning, they packed up their equipment and hiked back to civilization, carrying with them the plaster cast, the hair samples, and hours of thermal footage. Back in Seattle, Dr. Chen sent the new hair samples to a private genetics lab that specialized in unknown species identification. The results took 3 weeks and cost Ortiz nearly $1,000 out of pocket. When the report finally arrived, it was both fascinating and frustrating. The DNA was primate, but it didn't match any known species. The closest genetic relatives were humans and chimpanzees, but the markers were distinct enough to suggest a separate evolutionary lineage. The lab concluded that the samples came from either an undiscovered species or a hybrid of some kind, though they noted that natural hybridization between humans and other great apes was biologically impossible. So what does that leave? Ortiz asked Webb when they met to discuss the findings. It leaves something we don't have a name for, Webb said. Something that's been living in these forests long enough to develop its own unique genetic profile. A relic population, maybe. Or a species that diverged from the human family tree hundreds of thousands of years ago and survived in isolation. Ortiz felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. They were on the verge of something monumental, proof of a creature that had been relegated to myth and folklore, but she also knew what would happen if they went public. Ridicule, skepticism, demands for more evidence that might be impossible to obtain. And then there was Tyler. He'd started to improve over the summer. He was eating more, sleeping better, even talking about going back to school in the fall. But he still refused to discuss the cabin or the creature in any detail. Dr. Kimura believed he was compartmentalizing the trauma, locking it away so he could function. Pushing him to relive it could undo all his progress. Ortiz faced an impossible choice: pursue the truth and risk re-traumatizing Tyler, or let the case fade into obscurity, leaving the mystery unsolved. She chose a middle path. In August, she wrote a detailed report summarizing everything they'd found: the historical disappearances, the physical evidence, the thermal footage, the DNA results. She didn't use the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch. She simply described an unidentified primate species and recommended further study. She submitted the report to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, with copies to the National Park Service and the University of Washington's Biology Department. The response was polite but dismissive. Fish and Wildlife thanked her for the information, but noted that without a specimen, a body, bones, or living capture, they couldn't allocate resources to investigate. The Park Service filed the report away. The university expressed mild interest, but said they lacked funding for speculative research. Ortiz wasn't surprised. She'd known it would go this way. But then, in early September, something unexpected happened. A hiker named David Ortega was trekking through the same area where Tyler had disappeared. Ortega was experienced, well-equipped, and hiking with a GPS tracker. He was following a ridgeline about 10 miles from the cabin when he heard something behind him. Heavy footsteps, branches breaking. He turned, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a bear. What he saw was something else entirely. It stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadows. Ortega would later describe it as impossibly tall, with dark reddish-brown hair covering its entire body. The face was flat, almost human, with a pronounced brow and deep-set eyes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching him. Ortega did the smartest thing he could have done. He pulled out his phone and started recording. The footage was shaky, only about 15 seconds long, but it was clear enough. The figure stood motionless for a few seconds, then turned and walked back into the forest, moving with a fluid, powerful grace. Ortega captured it all: the height, the build, the way it moved. He posted the video online that night. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 2 million times. The media exploded. News outlets across the country picked up the story, running segments with titles like "Bigfoot Caught on Camera" and "Washington Hiker's Terrifying Encounter." Skeptics immediately called it a hoax, claiming Ortega had staged the whole thing with a person in a costume. But video analysts who examined the footage noted details that were hard to fake: the way the figure's muscles moved beneath the hair, the proportions of the limbs, the speed and fluidity of its gait. Ortiz watched the video a dozen times. She recognized the location. It was less than 2 miles from where they'd set up their cameras. This was the same creature. She was certain of it. She reached out to Ortega, who agreed to meet with her. He was shaken but credible, a software engineer from Portland with no history of hoaxes or attention-seeking behavior. He showed her the original video file, complete with metadata proving it hadn't been edited. "I don't know what I saw," Ortega told her, "but it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, it was something else." Ortiz believed him. The video reignited interest in Tyler's case. Reporters started calling Linda Bennett, asking for interviews. Linda refused them all, protecting her son from the media circus. But Tyler saw the video, and for the first time since coming home, he smiled. "That's it," he told his mother quietly. "That's what saved me." Linda called Ortiz immediately. When Ortiz arrived at their house, Tyler was sitting at the kitchen table, the video playing on a laptop in front of him. He looked calmer than she'd seen him in months. "I need to tell you something," Tyler said, "something I didn't say before." Ortiz sat down across from him, her heart pounding. Tyler took a deep breath. "The last night I was in the cabin before those skiers found me, it came inside. It sat down across from me by the fire. We just looked at each other. I wasn't scared anymore. I don't know why. It felt like it was saying goodbye." "Did it touch you?" Ortiz asked. Tyler nodded. "It put its hand on my shoulder, just for a second. Its hand was huge, warm, and then it left. The next morning, the skiers showed up." Ortiz felt chills run down her spine. "Tyler, do you think it knew they were coming? That it stayed with you until it knew you'd be found?" Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "I think it saved my life. And I think it's still out there, watching over that place. If it's real, why has it stayed hidden for so long?" The question haunted everyone who'd followed Tyler Bennett's story. If something like this truly existed, why had it remained hidden for so long? Dr. Marcus Webb had a theory, one he'd developed over decades of research into indigenous accounts and modern sightings. Survival, he told Ortiz during one of their many conversations that fall. Think about it. For thousands of years, humans have been the dominant predator on this continent. We've hunted everything: wolves, bears, cougars, bison. Anything that didn't learn to avoid us went extinct. If there's a primate species that survived this long, it's because it's mastered the art of staying invisible. "But why help Tyler?" Ortiz asked. "Why take that risk?" Webb leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Maybe because Tyler wasn't a threat. He was a kid, alone, dying. Maybe it recognized that, or maybe... He paused. Maybe it's happened before, more times than we know. Maybe there are other people out there who've been helped by these creatures and never told anyone because they knew no one would believe them. That possibility led Ortiz down a new path of investigation. She started reaching out to search and rescue organizations across the Pacific Northwest, asking about unusual cases, people who'd survived impossible situations, who'd been found in places they shouldn't have been, who told strange stories about their time in the wilderness. What she found was startling. Over the past 50 years, there were at least 24 cases that fit the pattern. A hunter in Oregon who'd broken his leg and claimed something had dragged him to shelter. A child in Northern California who'd been missing for 5 days and was found unharmed, saying a big hairy man had given her berries. An elderly woman in British Columbia who'd wandered away from a nursing home and survived a week in the mountains, later describing how something had kept her warm at night. Most of these accounts had been dismissed as delusions, hypothermia-induced hallucinations, or simple misidentifications. But when Ortiz compiled them together, a pattern emerged. These weren't random stories. They were consistent, detailed, and came from credible witnesses who had nothing to gain from lying. She shared her findings with Webb and Dr. Chen. They decided to do something unprecedented. They would attempt to document one of these creatures on their own terms, without intrusion, without capture, simply observing from a distance. In October 2020, they returned to the area around the cabin for an extended research expedition. This time, they brought more sophisticated equipment, long-range cameras with telephoto lenses, passive audio recorders that could run for weeks, and environmental DNA collection kits that could detect genetic material from soil, water, and air samples. They also brought someone new, a Snoqualmie elder named William Redhawk, who'd grown up hearing stories about the Tsemekwes from his grandmother. Redhawk was in his 70s, a retired logger who'd spent his entire life in the Cascades. He'd agreed to help after seeing David Ortega's video. "My grandmother told me the forest people were real," Redhawk said as they hiked toward the research site. "She said they were the guardians of the old places, the deep woods where humans weren't meant to go. She said if you respected them, they'd respect you. But if you hunted them, tried to capture them, they'd disappear forever." "We're not here to hunt," Webb assured him. "We're here to understand." Redhawk nodded approvingly. "Then maybe they'll let you see them." They set up a base camp a half-mile from the cabin, in a clearing near the creek. For the first week, they simply observed, taking notes on animal behavior, weather patterns, and the natural rhythms of the forest. They left offerings near the cabin, canned food, fresh fruit, blankets, and waited to see what would happen. On the 8th night, the offerings were gone. The trail cameras showed nothing, but the thermal sensors detected a heat signature passing through the area at 3 in the morning. Whatever had taken the offerings knew exactly where the cameras were and had avoided them perfectly. "It's testing us," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the data, "seeing if we're a threat." They continued the pattern, leaving offerings every few days, always in the same spot. And every time, the offerings disappeared. Slowly, over the course of 3 weeks, the heat signatures on the thermal cameras came closer, lingered longer. Whatever was out there was getting comfortable with their presence. Then, on a cold November morning, William Redhawk went for a walk alone. He told the others he wanted to check some of the remote cameras, but that wasn't the whole truth. Redhawk had felt something calling him deeper into the forest, a pull he couldn't explain. He followed game trails through dense undergrowth, climbing higher into the mountains, until he reached a place he'd never seen before, a natural amphitheater formed by ancient cedars, their trunks so massive it would take 4 people to encircle them. In the center of the clearing was a structure, not a cabin, but something more primitive, a shelter made from woven branches and bark built against the base of the largest cedar. and sitting in front of it, as if waiting, was the creature. Redhawk stopped, his breath catching. The creature was even larger than he'd imagined, easily 8 feet tall even while sitting. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, graying around the face and shoulders. The face itself was striking, more human than ape, with a flat nose, full lips, and eyes that held an unmistakable intelligence. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Redhawk slowly lowered himself to the ground, sitting cross-legged, making himself small and non-threatening. The creature watched him, its expression unreadable. Then, slowly, it reached beside itself and picked up something, a carved piece of wood, smooth and worn. It held it out toward Redhawk. Redhawk's heart pounded. He stood carefully, approached slowly, and took the object. It was a small figurine, crudely carved, but unmistakably human-shaped. A child, maybe, or a small adult. The creature made a sound, low, rumbling, almost like speech, but not quite. Then it stood, towering over Redhawk, and walked past him into the forest. It didn't look back. Redhawk returned to camp hours later, pale and shaken, clutching the wooden figurine. When he told the others what had happened, they could barely believe it. But the figurine was real, solid, undeniable proof that something intelligent had made it. Dr. Chen examined the carving under magnification. The tool marks were crude but deliberate, made with a sharp stone or possibly a claw. The wood was old, weathered, possibly decades old. "This is a gift," Webb said quietly. "It's communication. It's saying, 'I see you. I understand you.'" Ortiz held the figurine, feeling its weight, its history. "It's also saying goodbye," she said. "It's telling us this is as close as we're going to get." She was right. Over the following weeks, the thermal signatures stopped appearing. The offerings they left remained untouched. The forest went silent, as if whatever had been there had moved on, or simply decided the humans had seen enough. They packed up their equipment in early December and returned to Seattle. The expedition had yielded incredible data, environmental DNA samples that confirmed the presence of an unknown primate, audio recordings of vocalizations that didn't match any known species, and William Redhawk's testimony, which he agreed to share publicly. But they all knew it wouldn't be enough. Not for the scientific community, not for the government agencies, not for the skeptics who would demand a body, bones, irrefutable proof. Ortiz made peace with that. Some mysteries, she realized, weren't meant to be solved completely. Some truths existed in the space between knowing and believing. Tyler Bennett graduated from high school in the spring of 2021. He'd regained most of the weight he'd lost, and though he still had nightmares, they were less frequent. He'd started hiking again, though never alone, and never in the Cascades. He'd applied to colleges, planning to study environmental conservation. In his application essay, he wrote about his experience in the woods, though he left out the most unbelievable parts. He wrote about survival, about the kindness of strangers, about how the wilderness could be both terrifying and beautiful. He wrote about learning to trust again, to hope again. He didn't write about the creature. That was private, sacred, something he carried with him but didn't need to prove to anyone else. Linda Bennett framed the wooden figurine William Redhawk had given them. He'd insisted Tyler should have it. It sat on Tyler's desk, a reminder of those 4 months, of the impossible thing that had saved his life. Detective Sarah Ortiz retired from the Pierce County Sheriff's Office in 2022. She'd spent 30 years in law enforcement, solving cases, bringing closure to families. But Tyler's case was different. It was the one that changed how she saw the world, that opened her mind to possibilities she'd never considered. She stayed in touch with Dr. Webb and Dr. Chen, occasionally joining them on research trips into the wilderness. They never saw the creature again, but they found more evidence: footprints, hair samples, structures built from branches. enough to know it was still out there, still watching, still surviving. David Ortega's video remained one of the most analyzed pieces of footage in cryptozoology history. Experts were divided. Some called it the most compelling evidence ever captured. Others insisted it was an elaborate hoax. The debate would probably never be settled. But for those who'd been there, who'd seen the evidence firsthand, who'd heard Tyler's story and looked into his eyes, there was no debate. They knew. The cabin where Tyler had survived was eventually torn down by the Forest Service, deemed a safety hazard. But the location remained marked on Ortiz's personal maps, a place she visited once a year, always in late October, around the anniversary of Tyler's disappearance. She'd sit on the ground where the cabin had stood, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of the creek, and she'd think about everything that had happened, about the mystery that had consumed a year of her life, about the creature that had saved a boy's life and then vanished back into legend. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the forest went quiet, she'd feel it, that sense of being watched, of not being alone. She'd look into the shadows between the trees, searching for a shape, a movement, a pair of pale eyes reflecting the light. She never saw anything, but she always felt it. On a cold afternoon in November 2024, Tyler Bennett returned to Washington for the first time in 2 years. He'd been studying in California, working toward his degree, building a new life, but he'd felt the pull to come back, to see the place where everything had changed. Detective Ortiz, retired now but still detective to Tyler, picked him up from the airport. They drove east toward the mountains, talking about his studies, his plans, his life. But they both knew where they were really going. They parked at the old Clearwater Creek trailhead, the same place Tyler had left his car 5 years earlier. The forest looked the same, eternal, unchanging, indifferent to human time. They hiked together, following the trail Tyler had taken that October morning. Ortiz stayed close, watching him carefully, ready to turn back if it became too much. But Tyler seemed calm, focused, almost peaceful. They reached the area where the cabin had stood. Nothing remained except a slight depression in the earth and a few rotted logs. Nature had reclaimed it completely. Tyler stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his breath fogging in the cold air. Then he pulled something from his jacket, his old leather journal, the one he'd carried that day. He'd never written in it again after being found, couldn't bring himself to. But he'd kept it, carried it with him, a talisman of survival. He opened it to a blank page and wrote something. Then he tore the page out, folded it carefully, and placed it on the ground where the cabin door had been. He weighted it down with a smooth river stone. "What did you write?" Ortiz asked gently. Tyler smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in years. "Thank you." They stood together in the clearing as the afternoon light faded, filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. The forest was alive around them, birds calling, branches creaking, the eternal whisper of wind through pine needles. And somewhere, deep in the shadows where the old-growth cedars stood like sentinels, something watched them. Something that had been there long before humans named these mountains, and would be there long after. Something that understood survival, solitude, and the strange compassion that sometimes bridges the gap between species. Tyler felt it watching. He didn't turn to look, didn't try to see it. He just stood there, breathing the cold air, feeling the weight of the forest around him, and whispered 2 words into the gathering dusk. "I remember." The wind carried his words into the trees. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible, came a sound, low, rumbling, almost like a response. Or maybe just the forest itself, ancient and alive, acknowledging what had passed between its shadows and one fragile human life. Ortiz heard it too. She glanced at Tyler, saw the peace on his face, and understood. Some things didn't need to be proven. Some truths lived in the space between evidence and faith, in the stories we tell and the mysteries we choose to honor rather than solve. They hiked back to the car as darkness fell, leaving the forest to its secrets. Behind them, the note Tyler had written remained on the ground, held down by the river stone. The words were simple, heartfelt, meant for something that might never read them, but would understand nonetheless. By morning, the note was gone. Only the stone remained, sitting exactly where Tyler had placed it, as if marking something sacred, a memorial, a promise, a bridge between two worlds that had touched, briefly, impossibly, and changed each other forever. The forest kept its secrets. The creature, if that's what it was, remained hidden, a shadow among shadows, a myth that walked on two legs and left footprints too large to be human. The evidence existed, scattered and inconclusive, enough to make believers of some and skeptics of others. But Tyler Bennett knew the truth. He carried it with him every day, in the wooden figurine on his desk, in the dreams that still visited him some nights, in the certainty that he'd been saved by something the world wasn't ready to accept. And in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some wonders meant to stay wild, some truths meant to live in the hearts of those who'd experienced them rather than in the cold light of scientific proof. The Washington woods remembered everything, every footstep, every breath, every moment of terror and grace. And somewhere in those ancient forests, among the cedars and the mist, something else remembered too. Something that had watched a frightened boy stumble into a cabin and decided, for reasons we may never understand, to keep him alive. Something that had carried food through the snow, tended a fire, and sat vigil through the darkest nights of winter. Something that had touched a human shoulder in farewell and then walked back into legend. The story of Tyler Bennett's disappearance and miraculous survival would be told for years to come, debated and analyzed, believed and dismissed. But for those who'd been there, who'd seen the evidence and heard the testimony, who'd felt that presence in the forest, for them, there was no debate. They knew what lived in those woods, and they knew it was still out there, watching, waiting, surviving in the spaces between our world and the wild. Some called it Sasquatch, others called it a myth. Tyler Bennett called it the reason he was alive. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the Cascades and the forest whispered its ancient secrets, you could almost hear it, the sound of something massive moving through the trees, the guardian of the deep woods, the shadow that saved a life and asked for nothing in return except to be left alone. The mystery remained. The truth endured, and the forest, eternal and patient, kept its promise to protect what lived within its shadows. Was it real, or just what we needed to believe?